So now I will introduce our speaker this evening. Dean of Arts, Laura Robinson, is on the line, graduate of Acadia, class of 1988. Dr. Robinson is a long-standing L.M. Montgomery scholar. In addition to publishing many articles on Montgomery's writing, she curated a traveling and virtual exhibit entitled The Canadian Home Front, L.M. Montgomery's Reflections on the First World War, and acted as an academic consultant to Historica Canada's L.M. Montgomery Heritage Minute and on the Inspiring World of L.M. Montgomery Literary Tour. She is currently editing a collection of essays on Montgomery and gender. So boy, oh boy, do we ever have an expert amongst us this evening, and speaking to many of us, and many of whom in the East Coast are absolute Anne of Green Gables fans. So this will draw a big crowd, I'm sure. Dr. Robinson has prepared a presentation that I'm sharing actually on my screen, and will flip through the slides as she presents. Please take note of any questions that you have during the presentation. Either jot them down in front of you, or as I say, please feel free to write them in the chat function on the side, and we'll keep an eye on that. And then when it comes to the end of the presentation and the question period, we'll go through the questions in order. So I think I've covered everything. And I will pass it over to you, Laura.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me, and thanks to everyone for tuning in from wherever you are. I did type into the chat for people to let me know if you have familiarity with Anne of Green Gables. I've assumed that everyone is as big a fan as I am, but if anyone needs a little, update on Anne, I can provide that. So my paper today is looking at this question. While some readers argue that the iconic Anne capitulates to the social dictates around her, others have seen her as a feminist figure, breaking new ground for girls and women. So today I'm going to show how Montgomery subtly rewrites traditional stories to allow Anne to have agency while not isolating her from her community. So next slide, Una. So what I'm going to discuss this afternoon is we'll cover a brief background on Montgomery, and then a background on Anne of Green Gables. I'm going to look at Montgomery and gender roles, and then look at genre, in this case, the girl's story and female Bildungsroman, and then talk about Anne and gender roles very specifically. Next slide. So Montgomery was born in Clifton, PEI, on the 30th of November, 1874. Her mother died when she was 21 months old, and she was raised by maternal grandparents, Alexander and Lucy Woolner McNeill, in Cavendish, PEI. And they were, the Scottish Presbyterian, rigid, kind of unloving grandparents. Oh, sorry, next slide, Una. And I will note here that all the Montgomery photos are photos that from Montgomery's life come from the University of Guelph archives, an amazing collection. Check it out. She began writing when she was young and published quite a few poems and short stories. In 1907, however, she received notice that her novel manuscript had been accepted for publication. That was Anne of Green Gables, of course, which was published in 1908, and more on that in a second. Next slide. She agreed to marry Reverend Un McDonald in 1906. He's a pretty handsome fella. And that was before she got her acceptance from the publisher, which is interesting. They married in 1911, and it wasn't a very happy marriage. So we can talk about that in the question period if you'd like. Next slide. So I'm just going to give a critical history, brief one, of Anne of Green Gables. While Montgomery's manuscript faced several rejections at first, when Anne was finally published in 1908, it became an instant bestseller, lauded by everyone, including such notables as Mark Twain. Next slide, please. Montgomery produced a series of 8 books in total about Anne's life. And I put the publication dates in here because I think they're quite interesting. You can see that she went back and filled in gaps in Anne's life with Anne of Windy Poplars and Anne of Ingleside. And we can discuss that later too, if you'd like. The latest numbers on the first novel, Anne, are 50 million copies worldwide, translated into at least 36 languages, as well as Braille. and most recently Gaelic. And the Gaelic is about to, I believe it's a Halifax publisher, is about to come out this month or very soon, and has been adapted more than 24 times in various mediums, most recently a ballet, and that had the world premiere in Halifax this past winter. Next slide, please. Always considered popular rather than highbrow by the literary establishment. Of course, she's a woman writer writing about girls and women and rural Canada at that. So she was, Anne of Green Gables was at best, and Montgomery was at best overlooked, but mostly outright denigrated by scholars and critics, until the 1980s brought feminist literary critics to the fore. They reassessed women's writing and the place of women's writing in the literary canon. And Montgomery experienced a renewed surge of popularity because of new critical attention from feminist scholars, but also the Sullivan made-for-TV movies. You remember the CBC ones, which we all love, and the publication of Montgomery's journals started in the 80s as well. In 1994, Elizabeth Epperly established the L.M. Montgomery Institute at the University of Prince Edward Island, and that really solidified Montgomery studies as a legitimate field of studies. Next slide, please. Of course, Anne is loved by millions all over the world. She's never been out of print. Do you like how I talk about the book like it's her? People make pilgrimages to PEI. The tourism industry and many, many, many products are tied to this novel. Anne equals a multi-million-dollar tourist industry. And I've just listed some of the key players here. The heirs of L.M. Montgomery Inc. are it started really with her granddaughter. Tourism PEI, that photograph is actually from the Tourism PEI webpage. Avonlea Traditions is the company that created a lot of the dolls and paraphernalia. And because of it's all under contention, there's always legal battles and issues. Because of some issues at the beginning, the Anne of Green Gables Licensing Authority was developed as an agreement between the heirs of L.M. Montgomery Inc. and Tourism PEI. Lots of vested interests in this world, and I'm happy to discuss that later too. Next slide, please. It makes me wonder, all of this interest, why we keep rereading and retelling her stories. Why are so many different cultures and time periods interested in this irrepressible red-headed orphan? I think it might just be due in part to her fascinating and subtle battles with gender roles. I think they're as relevant in this #MeToo era as they were in 1908. As a girl raised by proper Presbyterian grandparents in rural Prince Edward Island, and then as a Presbyterian minister's wife, Montgomery was certainly aware that open rebellion against gender roles, gender constraints, while possible, was not advisable. Publicly, she often voiced conservative views. In 1910, for instance, she told a Boston reporter, "I am not a suffragette," adding, "I believe a woman's place is in the home." Far from being a woman who stays at home forever, Montgomery was speaking in that moment as a writer already famous for Anne of Green Gables, even while she may have wanted to protect her image by stating such conservative beliefs. That deft and subtle irony is Montgomery's trademark. While not an outspoken advocate for women's rights, Montgomery worked assiduously to tell women's stories and highlight domestic heroism in her tales, including in her journals. Montgomery's legacy of 21 novels and a multitude of stories repeatedly constructs girls and women who live, for the most part, in a feminine utopia. Those are the words of Eve Kornfeld and Susan Jackson. A world, they say, is largely populated by girls and women. Most famous, of course, is the lovable Anne, and she's influenced generations of writers such as Margaret Atwood, Alice Munro, and Jane Urquhart. While not a feminist trailblazer, as Nora Kaplan-Brickner points out in an article on Slate.com, Anne is a stealth feminist, to borrow Chloe Angel's very apt words. Angel says, this is a quotation, "On the surface, she adheres to all the requirements of early 20th century womanhood." And Angel lists, she's domestic, she's feminine, she's elegant, and then adds, but underneath all that, she's quite a rebellious young woman, and points out her drive for education, her rebelling against norms, all of those types of things. Moreover, I think girls books like girls' books like Anne of Green Gables are extremely important for scholars to look at because generations of women and men read them and identify strongly with the heroines. They use the heroines and their experiences to make sense of their own lives, just as we see Anne do in Anne of Green Gables. I believe Anne of Green Gables teaches readers how to have their cake and eat it too, how to get away with not conforming, but look like you're conforming. Next slide, please. At the time Anne of Green Gables came out, girls' stories were in the process of becoming a phenomenon. These are largely Bildungsroman, or novels about young people coming of age. Of course, Bildungsroman with female protagonists were quite different from those with male protagonists. One, more frequent than the other, ended in marriage. So girls' stories and female Bildungsroman, and I'm sure that you all know of Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. There's a book called The Daisy Chain by Charlotte Young, which was very popular in Victorian England, more popular than Dickens, but has since fallen out of favor. After Anne of Green Gables, of course, there's Pollyanna and Rebecca of Summerbrook Farm. I feel like that's wrong. Sunnybrook Farm. There we go. So those are the types of books. Can we go to the next slide, Una? Thanks. Elizabeth Segal, in an article called As the Twig is Bent, Gender and Childhood Reading, talks about these types of books. And she says, these types of books are designed to persuade the young reader to accept the confinement and self-sacrifice inherent in the doctrine of feminine influence. In the girl's book, the protagonist who resists the dictates of genteel femininity must be tamed, her will broken to accept a submissive and sedentary role. The so-called happy ending of such books is that she herself stops rebelling and chooses the approved role in order to gain or retain the love and approval of those around her. Next slide, please. Annis Pratt, in her book called Archetypal Patterns in Women's Fiction, talks about the female Bildungsroman, so the young girl's coming of age story. And this, if you can go to the next, this is an animated slide. There we go. She says, in this most conservative branch of the women's Bildungsroman, then, we find a genre that pursues the opposite of its generic intent. It provides models for growing down rather than growing up. So in Pratt's world, boys' stories or boys' Bildungsroman are about the young protagonist growing upwards and outwards, leaving their small town usually and going out into the world. And she says, really, it's the opposite for girl stories of this era. If you can do the next. Annis Pratt also adds, in the Bildungsroman proper, with its expectations that the hero is learning to be adult, there is the hidden agenda of gender norms, where adult means learning to be dependent, submissive, or non-adult. And if you could go to the next one, please. Actually, the next two, because it'll have Annis on the bottom there. The novel of development portrays a world in which the young woman hero is destined for disappointment. The vitality and hopefulness characterizing the adolescent hero's attitude towards her future here meet and conflict with the expectations and dictates of surrounding society. So Annis Pratt creates this kind of trajectory that shows that girls in girls' stories are often reined in as they go, as they develop, and that is the typical trajectory. So most frequently, what you have is a feisty tomboyish heroine who has scrapes and scrapes until she's successfully tamed at the end. You can think of Jo from Little Women, although I'd argue that she's not really that either. Many feminist critics have lamented this capitulation to pressures to conform at the end of these books. And I tend to focus more on the rest of the narrative, which seems to promote rebelliousness, regardless of the ending. The very first words of Anne of Green Gables set us up for Anne's development to be typical of the other heroines. And it's kind of a long quotation, so stay with me. Mrs. Rachel Lynde lived just where the Avonlea main road dipped down into a little hollow, fringed with alders and ladies' eardrops, and traversed by a brook that had its source way back in the woods of the old Cuthbert place. It was reputed to be an intricate, headlong brook, in its earlier course through those woods, with dark secrets of pool and cascade. But by the time it reached Lynn's Hollow, it was a quiet, well-conducted little stream, for not even a brook could run past Mrs. Rachel Lynde's door without due regard for decency and decorum. It was probably conscious that Mrs. Rachel was sitting at her window, keeping a sharp eye on everything that passed, from brooks to children up, and that if she noticed anything odd or out of place, she would never rest until she had ferreted out the whys and wherefores thereof. So Anne will be, the novel seems to indicate, like the headlong brook that learns to become well conducted. Anne's best friend, Diana, has the growing down trajectory that Montgomery sets up as a foil. She has some freedom as a child, but her parents don't want her reading much, and they refuse to provide the extra education that Anne receives. Diana is destined for a submissive and marriageable womanhood. And so in many ways, Diana becomes that well-conducted stream. Next slide, please. But Anne is a bit different, as we all well know. Montgomery highlights gender as a central issue. Anne is not wanted at Green Gables because she is a girl. Therefore, the entire text centers on revaluing and gaining acceptance for girlhood. Unlike other girls' stories heroines, Anne is not very tomboyish. All she wants is to be a girly girl. She poses a question to a bewildered Matthew right after she meets him. Next slide. Which would you rather be if you had the choice? Divinely beautiful, or dazzlingly clever, or angelically good? All these, I would argue, are very traditionally feminine, and poor Matthew has no idea how to answer that question. She gets into scrapes because of her desires to be feminine, not any kind of untamedness. She wears real flowers in her hair to church, which appalls everyone. She longs for puff sleeves on her dress, and she has a desire for raven locks instead of her red hair. Montgomery's narrator draws attention to how different Anne is from other storybook girls when she has her hair cut off because she dyed it green rather than the raven black she was hoping for. Next slide. She says, "This is such an unromantic affliction. The girls in books lose their hair in fevers or sell it to get money for some good deed. And I'm sure I wouldn't mind losing my hair in some such fashion half so much. But there is nothing comforting in having your hair cut off because you've dyed it a dreadful color, is there?" And it's interesting for those of you who know Little Women, because of course in Little Women, Jo cuts her hair off to get money to send to her father who's ill on the front lines in the Civil War. So Anne's development does seem to lend itself to being reined in or tamed. Marilla wants to tame her. This is a quotation. Marilla conceived it to be her duty to drill Anne into a tranquil uniformity of disposition, as impossible and alien to her as a dancing sunbeam in one of the brook's shallows. She did not make much headway, as she sorrowfully admitted to herself. The downfall of some dear hope or plan plunged Anne into deeps of affliction. The fulfillment thereof exalted her to dizzy realms of delight. Marilla had almost begun to despair of ever fashioning this waif of the world into her model little girl of demure manners and prim deportment. Neither would she have believed that she really liked Anne much better as she was. So Anne does change over the course of the novel. And what's funny is that as she does, Marilla laments those changes. Next slide, please. Marilla sees these changes, and this is what the narrator says. There were other changes in Anne, no less real than the physical change. For one thing, she became much quieter. Perhaps she thought all the more and dreamed as much as ever, but she certainly talked less. Marilla noticed and commented on this also. "You don't chatter half as much as you used to, Anne, nor use half as many big words. What has come over you?" Marilla is actually dismayed by and laments Anne's change. "I was wishing," these are Marilla's words, "I was wishing you could have stayed a little girl, even with all your queer ways. You've grown up now and you're going away and you look so tall and stylish and so So different altogether in that dress, as if you don't belong in Avonlea at all. And I just got lonesome thinking it all over. And Anne's response is interesting. I'm not a bit changed. Not really. I'm only just pruned down and branched out. The real me, back here, is just the same. It won't make a bit of a difference where I go or how much I change outwardly. At heart, I will always be your little Anne. And I feel that that is the key here. Anne learns not to get in as many scrapes, doesn't have all the problems that she has, but she's still the feisty heroine that we know and love. And arguably, the people who change in this novel are Marilla and Matthew, and the whole town of Avonlea. Marilla learns to lighten up and have a sense of humor over the course of the novel, and learns to love. At the end of the novel, Mrs. Rachel Lynde exclaims to her husband, "Marilla Cuthbert has got mellow, that's what." And all of Avonlea seems to change and accept and change their impressions of this orphan over the course of the novel. For me, the heartrending moment of the novel is when Anne is out in the fields with Matthew and suddenly sees that he's not doing well physically. She says, "If I had been the boy you sent for," said Anne wistfully, "I'd be able to help you so much now and spare you in 100 ways. I could find it in my heart to wish that I had been just for that." Matthew responds, "Well now, I'd rather have you than a dozen boys, Anne," said Matthew, patting her hand. "Just mind you that. Rather than a dozen boys. Well now, I guess it wasn't a boy that took the Avery scholarship, was it? It was a girl. My girl that I'm proud of." To me, that is the moment of acceptance. The whole force of the novel has been to revise and revalue girlhood. For those of you, spoiler alert, of course, Matthew dies, and Anne must relinquish her scholarship and universities to stay at home to save Green Gables. Some feminist scholars have seen Anne's sacrifice of her scholarship as giving in to social pressure, to domesticity. The narrative leads us to a place where Anne has to give up her desires. However, while this is her duty, Anne gets what she's always wanted in this moment: a home, Green Gables. The power shifts in this moment. Now you remember at the very beginning, Anne could only stay at Green Gables conditionally. Marilla wasn't deciding whether to keep her or not because she wasn't the boy that was asked for. So suddenly, the power dynamic has shifted, and Marilla can only stay at Green Gables if Anne stays. Otherwise, she can't continue to stay there by herself. So it's shifted, and I think that that's a really key moment. And Anne declares quite clearly that she's still going to study her arts program at home. So not much has changed. What about the romantic element of Anne and Gilbert? That's a good question. And I'm not answering a lot of it, so we can discuss in question period if you want to. Is it too conventional? Is this the typical heterosexual romance, or is Montgomery up to something here? I see it as kind of a way to disguise Anne's ambition. It looks like she's competing with Gilbert repeatedly throughout the narrative. She wants to do the best in each class because otherwise Gilbert will get ahead of her. But we can discuss that in more details. The next slide, please. I just want to draw your attention to, and again, going back to the point about how Montgomery is really into a stealth feminism and an irony here. The last lines of the book. Anne whispers lines from Robert Browning's Pippa Passes to herself, feeling content and comfortable. A lot of bad stuff has happened. They've found the path forward. God's in his heaven, all's right with the world, are the last words, which sounds very lovely, doesn't it? So in Robert Browning's Pippa Passes, Pippa is a young very innocent textile worker on her one day off a year. That's it. So this is the storyline that's from Victorian Web. As she wanders the streets on her annual holiday, she brushes shoulders with pimps, prostitutes, debauched students, informers, hired assassins, and parasites of every variety. Her immunity to worldly degradation lies in her very unworldliness. She is a child of nature, unlettered in experience, guileless, endowed only with a happy disposition, innocence, and the wisdom of her intuitions. So that's from Victorian Web. It seems a little incongruous with this novel, and you can be sure that Montgomery knew the poem well. She had works of Browning in her collection. So it wasn't an unintentional irony to have Anne quoting Pippa at the very end of the novel. And it's irony that Anne, in all her innocence, repeats these lines. So the disturbing context of the poem in which the original calls into question how right everything is, because it echoes the same message that's in Pippa Passes. Pippa thinks God's in his heaven, all's right with the world, but the knowing reader understands that it's not. And similarly, the knowing reader of Anne of Green Gables might not see that either, might see that the world is not happy. Can we see that irony as an active, positive position, that kind of happiness that she's creating, or capitulation to the status quo? She's got no choice. She'll be happy. And these are the questions that arise. What choice does she have? What are her options? What is Montgomery trying to tell us about the lives of girls and young women? And again, I see this as stealth feminism, and fits in, but changes the status quo. Montgomery gives us a happy ending, but creates a little unease about it. And perhaps that's the most compelling reason we keep returning to Montgomery's delightful books and poignant journals, particularly in these chaotic times. The message that an orphan's unflagging optimism and diligent work can transform outdated sexist attitudes and effect lasting change for women and humanity might just be the balm we need to carry on and fight another day. Next slide, and thank you. Awesome.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Laura. I am going to keep an eye on the chat function on the right-hand side. As I said, for everyone on the call, if you would like to unmute yourself and ask the questions, you absolutely please feel free to. If you would like to write your questions on the side, we will make sure that they are orated for Dr. Robinson to answer. So I'll give it a moment, but maybe what I'll do, Laura, if you're okay with it, is I'll start off with the question asking and pose something to you. So the first question that we'll throw out there and see if we can get the Q&A going is, how does the new Anne with an E Netflix show compare to the novel?
Right. So when Anne with an E came out, it was first called Anne, and it was on CBC. People were quite, well, they were intrigued, but also outraged, because Maura Walley-Beckett, so she's the creator of Breaking Bad, and she also created Anne with an E, took a dark side to it. Us Montgomery scholars kind of loved it, because we see that darkness in Anne of Green Gables. It's, you know, all those narratives are there. The dark, you know, Anne is coming from an awful place. She's been in an orphanage, and before that she was passed from home to home, where she had to labor as a child in order to be kept, and was unwanted. So the stories aren't happy ones, even though the narrative, overarching narrative, is a happy one. And so Maura Walley-Beckett kind of flips it and brings out the darker threads of the story. Now that said, she kind of goes way off script with, you know, grifters showing up and Matthew attempting suicide or about to commit suicide. It's kind of interesting, and I haven't seen the third season yet, but I appreciate what she's doing in that. I do think she's pulling out things that are in the Anne books and highlighting them.
Terrific. I see that Wendy Eliot has posted on the side that was her question. And she says, what do you think, Laura, of the new TV version? And then she says, and the reason I'm reading this out, Wendy, is because I'm wondering if you'd like to continue it a bit with your final quote of her question that says, personally, I found it cringeworthy. Over to you, Wendy.
No, I'm mute.
Oh, we can hear you.
We can hear you.
Oh, you can hear me. Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, I couldn't watch it. I just felt like the whole literate part of it was tossed out the window to be topical in the 21st century. And it's a different century and it's a different time. And
yeah, I can totally understand that. I watched the first season with great interest and then forced myself to watch the second season because I was writing a paper on it. And I have written an article on the first season. And I do agree. I mean, I loved her, the actress that played Anne. I thought she was great. But I'm so interested in the narrative. You know, Anne of Green Gables is a pastoral. So the whole notion is that it's this idealized world that we're in. And Wally Beckett's world is not a pastoral. It's not idealized at all. But I think it's almost a call to action to see what's wrong with the world, and because we want to return to a more idealized world. So I think there's something really quite interesting going on there. And then I don't know, Wendy, if you paid attention to the outcry when they canceled it after the third season. These fans have galvanized, like, it's quite remarkable. They took out billboards in Times Square and in Dundas Square in Toronto. They have galvanized on CBC. So if there's ever comments open on a CBC article, they all come in and start talking about renewing Anne with an E, which is, so even if it's not on that, like, we should get them behind solving the pandemic or something, these fans, because they are on it. So some people have found it completely captivating, which is interesting.
yeah.
Your comment of I forced myself to watch it doesn't really give it rave reviews, I must say. But your comment about, you know, looking to sort of return to that idealistic world, I mean, I wonder if the number of readers have increased in the last, I don't know, 3 months.
Absolutely. So one of my admin assistants at my former institution started watching the television show and had never read Anne before. And then she was like, oh, should I read it? And I'm like, yes. I brought her in a stack. and she just loved it. She couldn't get enough of it. And what I found interesting about that is that there's a whole bunch of people, like a generation, whose first experience of Anne of Green Gables is Megan Follows and the Sullivan CBC version. And then they discovered Anne through that. Well, we have a whole another generation now to whom Anne with an E is their first encounter, so their origin Anne, whereas mine is really the books. So, I mean, I think how you experience something then really has an impact on how you take it. So, you know, there's the whole Megan Follows is always the Anne. There'll never be another Anne.
So just to back up a little bit. So there were a couple of times during your presentation, Laura, that you said, if you'd like to talk about that in the Q&A, absolutely. So I'm wondering if folks picked up on that, because I jotted one down that I will come back to in a moment. Also find it ever so mildly amusing that somebody would say to you, should I read Anne of Green Gables?
The answer is always yes.
Laura Robinson says, no, only if you have time. So Donalda Macbeth says, Laura, any thoughts on why Anne has been so embraced worldwide?
Well, do you remember that slide with the tourism industry? I think there's a little bit going on there. There's so many different reasons. I mean, I think in different cultures, so the translations occurred at different times, and probably different times that were important to women's culture. So I know I've worked with some Icelandic translators who are now retranslating Anne in Icelandic, because the first version took out all the feisty bits, which is kind of interesting. And then we're seeing that. We also worked with a Slovakian scholar who was looking at the different Slovak versions. So I just think it's often timing. It's something was translated into that language, and then it captivated people because maybe something was going on with girls and women at that time period. The reason why the Japanese are so intrigued by it, I mean, multiple reasons, but really one is deeply practical. It was translated into Japanese and then put into the school curriculum. So for several, generations, everyone going through Japanese school read Anne of Green Gables. So it's that simple. Now that begs the question, why Anne? Why was that the text that everyone read? Do they see this as something that helps inculcate individuals into proper submissive citizenship? So it is quite, the answers just lead to more questions, really. One of the interesting things is that during the Second World War, Polish soldiers were given Polish copies, of course, of The Blue Castle. Montgomery's only adult novel, and I don't mean that in an XXX way, just not one meant for young people. And, which is so fascinating. And it's because it's a novel of overcoming adversity, and they felt that that would help the soldiers on the front lines. So there was obviously a whole movement in Poland of people reading Montgomery. So I think it's really different in every different culture, but the translations, for some reason, people picked up on it. And it could be as easy as marketing. P.C. Page, who published it in the first place, a Boston publisher, was simply a businessman. He was not really interested in this. He handed the manuscript to his niece, and she read it and said, "This is amazing, you should publish this." And he basically then started girls' stories publishing because he saw that there was a market, that there were no books. So he's the one who published all the books like Pollyanna that then went on to great fame. So some of it could just be driven by economics as well.
So then what was the reasoning, or what you thought was the reasoning, that it was introduced into the Japanese school system?
Well, I think it would take Japanese scholars to answer that question, but it could be, I think that this is a very rebellious text, but under a surface of what appears to be conformity, right? And so maybe people are seeing more of the conformity part of it. And I've not read any comparison of the Japanese translation to the English translation. So that would be really interesting, or at least the original Japanese. And so that would be interesting to see if they've changed it and made it even more. We often choose things for school systems that help create good citizens. So it might be something like that. I don't know. It's fascinating questions. And then all kinds of others, Japanese scholars have talked about Japanese girls want to be like Diana. They want to have a friend like Anne, whereas often North American girls, it's flipped. And, the Japanese are just fascinated by this young person who is irrepressible and can't conform.
Interesting. Thank you. So we have Barb Anderson lined up here with 2 questions. What do you think L.M. Montgomery would think of the marketing of Anne, the dolls, the bottles of raspberry cordial, the hats with red braids, the saltwater taffy, the pinafores for little girls, ? Also, I am interested in L.M. Montgomery's published letters. What are some of the learnings you think I would get from the read? Oh dear, she's gone to get some show and tell, I think.
I have so much show and tell, but I do have a bottle of raspberry cordial that might be 20 years old. But when I teach Anne of Green Gables, I come in with the whole dog and pony show. I think she'd be devastated, truly. She might be pleased. There would be part of her that was pleased. She did like the pomp and grandeur that was shown her. When the Governor General came to visit and wanted to meet with Miss Montgomery and Prince Edward Island, that was an amazing moment for her. When Page took her to Boston and feted her, that was amazing for her. So that part would be interesting. I think she'd be kind of intrigued by all the other versions of Anne. She was alive for 2 of the movies. So, and, had a lot to say about them in her journals. So I think she would have been intrigued by some of it, but I think really disheartened, especially by PEI. And I do believe that Green Gables was made a National Historic Site before she died. So she knew that. But I think it was a little disheartening to her. And I just think, I kind of loved several of us scholars have sort of a kitschy love for all the different things. One of my colleagues collects all the weird paraphernalia.
Is now exiting.
So Montgomery's journals, I think, are amazing. I think she kept copious journals, and they're all in the University of Guelph archives, and they're all so they published selected journals in 5 volumes from the 80s to the 90s, and now they're returning to them and doing the complete journals, because I think University of Oxford Press had no idea that people would be so interested in these journals. They're heart-rending. I mean, she details everything that's going on in culture, so they're a treasure trove for historians. Barb, you're a nutrition person. They're a treasure trove of food and practice that's going on in the time period, because she talks about everything that goes on in a day. She's making grape jam, then she has to go out and minister to a grieving family, then she writes 20 pages of a novel. Like, it's such a fascinating, she covers everything that's going on. And her war journals are quite fascinating too, because she traces the war as it, or the Canadian side to the war as it unfolds.
Mm-hmm. I go back to a bit of your answer on the first of Barb's questions, Laura, and you know, being from Newfoundland, born and raised in Newfoundland, you know, overseas, PEI meant 2 things for me. One was my father was a potato breeder, so it meant potato eating island. Literally, that's what I thought it was until I was quite old. And also home of Anne of Green Gables. I mean, that was a big piece of that identity, you know, in obviously just a short distance across the water, but interesting that it has made its way and made its impact around the entire world. We've got a comment from Kimberly Shute, who says, I heard something about there being a lot of orphans in Japan after the war. Thus, a lot of people related. So that's likely, you know, a really good connection. Makes some logic for sure.
Yeah, and just the heartwarming story of an orphan as a pick-me-up after such a devastating war too. But yeah, that's a really good point.
So also in answering your question, the questions, Laura, you mentioned the different versions of Anne, and that brings me to perhaps another thought process about the later novels, or the later Anne novels, and whether or not Anne was still a feminist figure in those.
Yeah, see, this is really interesting. Oh, her name's not coming to you, but there is an article written called The Decline of Anne. And the scholar argues that as Anne progresses through her life, she gets more and more disappointing and more just Mrs. Dr. Blythe, Gilbert's wife, and the kids take over the story, of course. And it is kind of interesting, but I also think Montgomery's up to stuff. So when I talk about Anne's, the novels, I usually do it in the order in which they're written rather than the order of Anne's life, because I think that makes it way more interesting. So later in 1936, Montgomery revisited, and, you know, multiple reasons, probably financial was a big one, because it was, you know, Depression era, and she knew she could make some more money on Anne books. But she went back and wrote Windy Poplars, where Anne's the superintendent of a school, becomes the superintendent, where she has this fraught relationship with this woman, which is really interesting. And then in 1939, she goes back to Anne of Ingleside and fills in a gap in Anne's story with her children. And in that one, there's troubles with her and Gilbert, which is really fascinating. And that was the last published novel of her lifetime. The very last novel, the Blythes were quoted, which wasn't published until 2008. She delivered and then died, reportedly by suicide. It's difficult to confirm that. And that novel is just all over the place, and everyone has conflict and problems, and it's a very modernist style of narrative. It's all disjuncture. It appears to be short stories with little narrative threads about the Blythe family in between them. It's quite interesting.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Do we have any other questions? I don't want to keep going with questions. I want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity. I think we've been keeping a good eye on the meeting chat, so not seeing any. I'll go back to one of the ones that you said. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you want to. You referenced the Not a Very Happy Marriage and very quickly said, well, we can talk about that later. So
Yeah. So it's interesting because, and this is the heartbreaking part of Montgomery's life. She lived in a house with her grandmother. So her grandfather died, and Montgomery was a school teacher, and she went home to care for her grandmother when her grandfather died. The house, of course, the grandmother could stay in the house, but it no longer belonged to her because it wasn't passed to wives at that point. It belonged to the son. And so the son and his family were quite anxious to have the house. But as long as the grandmother was alive, she and Montgomery could continue to live in the house. So Montgomery knew that upon her grandmother's death, she would be homeless, basically. So, along comes this quiet, whatever Presbyterian minister, and she agrees to marry him. He goes back to Scotland where he continues his training. I think it was Scotland. And next thing you know, she writes this famous novel. Then her grandmother, although, the fame, if it's published in 1908, the fame isn't immediate, even though it was an instant bestseller. So she gets married, and when people promised to get married, they did it back in those days, right? They rarely backed away from it. So she marries him in 1911, when her grandmother dies, and he was a very ill man. They diagnosed him with religious melancholia, and he would fall into these fits of despair where he believed he was damned, which is a very interesting thing for a Presbyterian minister to believe. So he would get into kind of catatonic states. Other people have looked at everything since and said he was probably bipolar. But one of the fascinating things, she wrote Mistress Pat. What she would do was she would take a piece of paper and rip it in half. And so one side was whatever the original was. And then she wrote her manuscripts on the other side on half sheets of paper. Mistress Pat, when she wrote that, she knew she was famous. She knew her manuscripts would be kept. She was really famous at that point. She wrote on the back of Ewan's medical diagnosis. So I'll tell you, when I went to the Confederation Center for the Arts in Charlottetown to look at the manuscript, I just read the backsides. I was fascinated by I felt like she was selecting pieces of paper for posterity for us to read and know how difficult her life was. And in her journals, she wants to talk about things, but she restrains herself. But she's still putting it out there so we can see that there is stuff going on. So fascinating.
very clever.
Oh, yeah.
Donalda says you also mentioned that there are many who have vested interests in Anne of Green Gables in this world. So it shows beyond disappointment with how Anne has been commercialized? ?
So, Donalda, I'm not sure I completely understand, but I guess in some ways there's been a battle and amongst people. So at first in the 80s was when the heirs of L.M. Montgomery Inc. incorporated. And at that point, basically it kind of destroyed the cottage industry and PEI because they started to regulate all images of Anne of Green Gables. I'm just looking at this. Gosh, this might not be. Usually everything has an approved thing on it, which is quite funny. So, little old ladies that were knitting little Anne dolls and selling them off their back porch could suddenly no longer do that kind of thing. So PEI, of course, responded negatively to that. Tourism PEI responded negatively. And there was a bit of a battle back and forth. And so in that case, that's why the Anne of Green Gables Licensing Authority was created. And both the heirs of L.M. Montgomery Inc. and Tourism PEI, I believe, are equal partners at that table. And I get it. I've had some pretty heartfelt conversations with the granddaughter and the lawyer for the heirs of L.M. Montgomery Inc. And, Montgomery's images and material has been used. I mean, she was always in copyright battles as well in her lifetime. So, I mean, she's been in legal battles from the get-go. And, you know, their whole thing was to try to keep the integrity of her image. And, you know, we see it as sort of staying on brand, but it wasn't just an economic thing for the granddaughter. It was about not having Marilla's Pizzeria in Cavendish, which I think there was one back in the day. It was that type of thing. And, you know, the PEIers had a good time with that when it first happened. You know, I remember sitting at a patio drinking, what was it? Tipsy Redhead. And then in parentheses, it said, you know who we mean, because of course they couldn't. And everyone told me I had to have that drink because of course I have. Of course. So it's a very interesting, and then Avonlea Traditions that made the dolls, I believe there's still an ongoing court battle between them and the heirs of L.M. Montgomery Inc. I could be wrong. It might be resolved now by now, but and Sullivan, don't get me started on Sullivan and the heirs, huge battle. And then the heirs also, there was a gosh, what's the word I want? Before Parliament, bill before Parliament. It was a library bill. It was about amalgamating library and archives, the National Library and Archives. And appended to that bill was the Montgomery Clause, which is fascinating, and it wasn't just Montgomery, they wanted to extend the years after death for unpublished materials. And it was so that the journals would not be able to be published, I think. There was something there. And so it was so just to try to keep control over that material for longer, which is really quite fascinating. They called it the Montgomery Clause, but it was a generalized clause for all. And I don't think it passed. I think they had to unpin it from the original bill, which is just fascinating.
Mm-hmm. It reaches far and wide in all kinds of literary senses and political senses and in societal senses. Sorry, go ahead, Laura.
I was just going to say, I find it like the Harry Potter phenomenon. It's not just about the books. Yes, they're great, but there's an apparatus that's around the book that keeps it. I feel like the Harry Potter people are like, Harry's been out of the news for 3 months. Let's have some scandal and get everyone talking about him again. So it's a very similar thing. And Anne is always trotted out in ways to create scandal, which is another whole.
That's another session.
That's another whole session.
You know, it was just the other day that I was chatting with my older son about, you know, typical stereotypical roles for men and women. And he says to me, well, surely it's okay if a woman chooses to pursue a stereotypical female role if she wants to. And I said, well, absolutely. And I referenced Mona Lisa Smile. I don't know if you're familiar with that movie or not, but one of the smartest, most accomplished women in that movie decided she wanted to stay home and be a housewife and a mother. So it sounds like I've got some additional reading suggestions for him.
Everyone should read Anne of Green Gables.
Absolutely. So folks, I'm just going to offer up one last opportunity for questions. Just a comment there from Wendy saying so many avenues of interest in Montgomery's story. Thank you.
Could I
yes, absolutely.
I've been interested to hear the parallels really between some of the portions of the novels over time and Lucy's own life experiences. Is there any sort of a biography on her that tracks the parallels between her own experiences and what she writes about in these books?
Oh, yes. Oh, gosh. Are there? I can't grab it right now. So the official biography
is called... This is Shelley asking the question, Laura.
Okay, great. The official biography by Mary Rubio is called L.M. Montgomery, A Gift of Wings. That one's interesting, but Elizabeth Waterston, I think this is sort of more directly what you're looking for. Elizabeth Waterston wrote, oh my gosh, what is it called? I can get that for you and let you know what it's called. Maybe, I can pass that along to you. But Elizabeth Waterston, it's a book that recently came out. I believe there's a ship on the front of it. Oh, here it is.
And the show and tell continues.
Magic Island, The Fictions of L.M. Montgomery. So she kind of does that. This is what was going on in her life. So every chapter is one of her books, and she does that sort of direct connection, which is quite interesting.
Uh-huh.
I'm more interested in how she transformed what was going on in her life in her books. So when her journals first came out, everyone's like, look, she wrote this in her journals, and here it is in her novel. But the cool thing is, at one point when she knew she was famous, she rewrote all of her journals in uniform account style books and burned the originals. So in some ways, and I mean, this is a woman who cultivated her image very carefully and then commented often as she was rewriting them from a future time, if only I knew what was going to happen next. Yeah, it's so fascinating. So we wonder how much cultivation happened there, and maybe some of the words from the novels made their way into the journals rather than the other way around, which is quite fascinating.
Yeah, interesting.
Terrific. Thank you for your question, Shelley. And thank you for your responses, Laura, and your presentation. Your passion and excitement is infectious. It's absolutely wonderful, and we so appreciate you spending your time with us this evening. As a faculty member, our Dean of Arts, and of course one of our own family members in terms of being alumni as well. So thank you so much for your time. And thank you everyone for joining us this evening. If you would like to know more about Dr. Laura Robinson, you will be able to read more about her in the bulletin, which will be in your mailboxes any day now. So she's on the cover with her colleague deans in the other faculties, and you can read a bit more about Dr. Laura Robinson inside the bulletin.